And you see me here as a published author today with, 5 books in print, if you count Aragon's Guide to Alagasia. And you probably are thinking to yourself, oh, well, he must have always enjoyed reading and writing. He's an author. The truth of it is, when I was really, really young, even younger than some of you are now, and my mom was teaching me how to read, and I absolutely hated it. In fact, I marched up to her and I said, I'm never going to use reading my entire life. It has nothing to do with the real world. Yeah, you can see how that turned out. Fortunately for me, she didn't listen to me, and she kept teaching me, and eventually she took me to the public library where we were living, which was up in Alaska, where the mosquitoes are the size of your fist, and they chase you down, and if they catch you, they leave nothing but a desiccated corpse behind. But I was going around in the children's section, and on the shelves, I found the series of very thin detective novels. And they had bright covers and interesting titles, so I pulled one out and checked it out. And it was the very first book I'd ever checked out on my own. And when I started reading it, for whatever reason, it was as if a switch just got flipped inside of my head. And instead of seeing the word for, say, sunset on the page, I could actually see a sunset in my head. And it was really like magic. And in fact, I think the ability of books to transport you to other places and into other people's minds really is the closest thing we have to magic in this world. Unfortunately, it was so long ago when I read that book, I don't remember the title of it. But I do remember that it involved tomato sauce being mistaken for blood, which seemed very exciting to me when I was 5 years old. So that's what got me into reading and writing, and I just read voraciously growing up, and then eventually I graduated from high school at 15, the result of not taking any summer breaks my whole life. Thank you, Mom. And when I graduated, I thought, this is going to be awesome. No more school. And it was awesome for about 2 weeks. And then I got really, really, really bored. How bored? I got so bored, I went into our backyard and I dug a hole. And I'm actually very proud of this hole. It was a big hole. It was 8 feet deep. It was over 8 feet across. It was circular. And when after I finished digging this, I went and I grabbed, there was an old, one of those big old satellite dishes like you used to see all over the place, one of those big old television satellite dishes, and it was abandoned on our property. So I went over and I dragged it over to the hole all by myself, tipped it upside down, and used it to make a dome-shaped roof for the hole. And then I took hay bales, because there were, it's Montana, there are hay bales everywhere, and I piled hay bales on the satellite dish and used it for insulation, and then I stripped bark off of dead trees and used them for shingles on top of the hay bales. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, Christopher, if you put a satellite dish on top of the hole, how did you get into the hole? Well, I dug a tunnel into the hole. And then I built an entryway for the tunnel. And then I started chopping down dead trees along the river, using a claw hammer, I might add, dragging the trees up to the hole, and there planting them upright in the ground to form the framework for what was going to be a Viking-style mead hall. Now, when you start digging giant holes like that and building Viking mead halls in your backyard, you are officially bored. And I realized that I needed to find something to do with myself, aside from digging holes. And I didn't have to do anything. I wasn't in school, I didn't have a job, and the nearest town was over a half-hour away, and the entire state of Montana has only about 1 million people, which is far less than the entire, this city, I bet. So, and I think everyone should have this experience where you don't have to do anything. And whatever it is you choose to do in that time is probably what you should do as a profession. And in my case, it was telling stories. I decided that I wanted to try and write the sort of story I would enjoy reading myself. And of course, what I enjoyed reading growing up was fantasy. So I knew that the book was needed to have elves and dwarves and dragons and a magic sword and a wise old mentor and an evil villain. And that's what got me into Aragon. And I had a lot of fun writing Aragon. And I did stuff, I tried to entertain myself in the book. So I did things like, if you've read any of the books, you'll know the character of Angela the herbalist. Well, I actually based her partly on my own sister, Angela. And fortunately, she has a very good sense of humor about it, or else I wouldn't be standing here right now. And I should say, I did not exaggerate her in the slightest. If anything, I underplayed her. That is my sister in the books. But at the end when I finished the first draft, and I sat down and I read it through, I was very excited because I got to read my own book for the very first time. The only problem was, it was horrible. It was awful. The story was there, but the writing itself needed help. Now you're probably saying to yourself, oh come on, it couldn't have been that bad. Well, I've never told anyone this before this book tour, but now that the series is done, I don't have trouble talking about it. But in the very first draft of Aragon, Aragon was not named Aragon. Aragon was named Kevin. And not only was he named Kevin, but along his way to meeting up with the Varden and the dwarves, Kevin had a really interesting encounter with a unicorn. So, if your name is Kevin, by the way, it's a great name, but I just don't think that many people would have bought the series if it had been the story of the great Kevin the Dragon Rider. So when I finished rewriting Aragon, I gave it to my parents, and fortunately for me, they liked the books enough, we decided we were going to try to self-publish it and make it a family business. And that's what we did, and I ended up traveling all across the western half of the United States in medieval costume, doing events. And yes, first event I did was in our local high school. Very first time I'd ever walked into a public school. I was the same age as the kids there, and I'm wearing these black knee-high lace-up leather boots, billowy black pantaloons, a big black pirate belt, billowy red swordsman shirt, and a black beret to top it off. And when I walk into the school library where the presentation was, I hear a guy in the back of the room go, "Hello, Romeo!" As you might have noticed, I don't wear this costume anymore. But I spent a lot of time down here in Texas with the self-published edition, and the people here really helped support the series, and if it wasn't for the amazing response from readers in Texas, this would not have happened. None of this series would have happened. Eventually, of course, Random House picked up Aragon, and the rest, as they say, is history. I wrote Eldest, I wrote Brissinger, and now, of course, Inheritance. And in fact, yeah, I'm pretty happy with that too. And I've had a great time along the way. Some great experiences, great stories. For example, when I was preparing for the book tour for Eldest, I was in my room, hard at work. Okay, no, never mind. That was a lie. I was playing video games. I was actually playing a game called Jedi Knight Academy 2. And so I was dueling with people from all around the world, dueling with lightsabers, and I was pretty good. But some guy logged into the game using the name Aragon. And I said to myself, oh, I've got to fight this guy. So we set up and dueled each other. And the horrible thing was, he was really good. In fact, he was better than me. And he beat me. And across the screen it said, "You have been killed by Aragon." I didn't need to see that. And then on the tour for my the third book, Brissinger, I was in Chicago. And it was a pretty long signing, late signing. It was like 11 o'clock. A young woman came through the line, and on her arm she was carrying a sugar glider. Now, for those of you who don't know, sugar gliders are kind of like flying squirrels, but they're marsupials, so they have a pouch in front, and they are very, 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 very cute. So I looked at her, and I said, well, that's an interesting animal. Do you mind if I pet it? And she said, oh, go right ahead. He doesn't bite. So I reach out and I start petting the sugar glider, and it looks up at me, and it takes its hands, they have hands like raccoons, it takes its hands and it wraps its fingers around my finger, and then ever so politely, it just begins to gnaw on my finger. And I'm sitting there, and there's blood running down my hand. And I'm looking at the woman and saying, will you please stop your pet from trying to eat me? But all things considered, I'm glad it happened, because it makes for a good story. And ever since, I think I'm one of the few people now in the world who can now say that I have been chewed on by a marsupial. So I think that's like an achievement in the Xbox or something, you know? Chewed on by a marsupial. 50 points. Actually, maybe that should be 250 points. It's a hard achievement to get. And then, of course, when I was working on the last week of editing for Inheritance, very last week on this series as a whole, I was in New York City at the Random House headquarters with my editor, and in that very final week, New York City got hit by both an earthquake and a hurricane. And my editor came up to me and she said, Christopher, I love you dearly, but you really, really have to finish this series before any more natural disasters occur. So finish it I did. And here I am, and I'd love to answer a few of your questions before we go to the signing, but actually before I do, there's something I've been wanting to do ever since Aragon came out, and I have not had the chance until the series was complete. In fact, this tour is the first time I've been able to do this. And what I'd like to do is to read for you guys a very short excerpt from each of the 4 books. Yeah?